Hello, everyone, and welcome to another weekly webinar from the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Tapson for the Freedom Center, and today's very important speaker is David Horowitz himself. David, thank you for taking the time to be here.
Well, thanks for having me.
The title of this webinar is The Enemy Within: How a Totalitarian Movement is Destroying America. And that just happens to be the title of David's new book from Regnery Publishing. In just a moment, I will turn things over to David to discuss the book, and after he speaks, we'll make some time for him to take questions from our audience, and I'll come back on to help facilitate that. Meanwhile, as you're listening and watching, if you have any questions, please submit them via the question box on your screen. David, of course, is the founder of the Freedom Center and author of many best-selling books, including Radical Sun, Destructive Generation, The Black Book of the American Left, Dark Agenda, The War to Destroy Christian America, and Blitz, to name just a few. In his brand new book, David observes that America is facing our worst national crisis since the Civil War, thanks to a totalitarian movement that is hell-bent on not just the fundamental transformation of America, as Barack Obama used to put it, but its fundamental destruction. So let me turn this over now to David Horowitz to explain why that is, how we got to this point, and hopefully how we can pull back from the brink. David, the floor is yours.
Well, I think everybody here knows my background. I was brought up by communists. I was a leader of the New Left in the 60s. I edited its largest magazine. And I left the left when I realized that, of course, it wasn't about peace or justice or even an anti-war movement. It was an anti-American movement. It was a hate America. We actually published a book at the center called The Hate America Left. And that hate, and why do I say that? Well, the greatest victory of the 60s left, the so-called anti-war movement, was to drive America out of Vietnam and cause us to abandon our allies who were under attack from the communists. When the United States left, the communists won, and they proceeded to slaughter 2.5 million Indo-Chinese peasants. And there wasn't one single demonstration against that. And that showed me that I was involved in an evil movement that was driven by hate. My late writing partner, Peter Collier, used to say that he used to make me really mad because he would say that malice was what drives the left. And I didn't feel that I was malicious, but he was right. So my book, The Enemy Within, it's really an attempt to state things as they are. We have a kind of Orwellian newspeak and doublespeak dominating our national life. So people don't say they don't call it as they actually see it, or as we used to say in the 60s, they don't tell it like it is. The Democrat Party is an anti-American party. Let's just start with the news of the day. The Democrat Party wants to pack the Supreme Court. That's destroying a linchpin of the American system. Our system is based on a paradox, a constitutional paradox. The founders placed sovereignty in the hands of the people, but they distrusted the people. They know that people are swept up in passions of the day. I don't have to stress that in this period we're in now. And they can do terrible things swept up in these passions. So they created, our system is a system of checks and balances, and the separation of powers between 3 equal branches of government, of which the judiciary still is one, is a fundamental basis of our democratic order. It puts a check on the enthusiasm, shall we say, of the population. And I think everybody who's been paying attention to the news can see that information is a huge factor. There's so much misinformation out there. There's so much information that's being suppressed that people can't make good judgments. And it's very wise to put checks on them, on their ability to alter everything. But packing the Supreme Court is just one part of the Democrats' overall campaign to destroy American democracy. Another, very obviously, has been a long-running campaign, is to destroy the integrity of the electoral system, so that the Democrats have this campaign against voter IDs. It's a racist idea in the first place, because the basis, they call it voter suppression, to have a photo ID. That means that poor black people are too stupid to get photo IDs. Of course, if they don't have photo IDs, they can't get food stamps, they can't get welfare, they can't get prescription drugs, they can't get driver's licenses and so forth. It's a complete fiction. And the solution, if it were true, the easy solution would be to have a government program to provide access to voter IDs. If you can send out 92 million paper ballots, you could send out 92 million photo IDs also. But the Democrats don't want the people who vote to be identifiable. And that is because they want to steal elections. It's that simple. They want to make sure that it's relatively easy for illegal aliens, people who have moved out of state to vote several times, illegal aliens, felons to vote. The Pew Trust did a study, and when they send out these 92 million paper ballots, and yes, the last election was stolen. It's obvious to anybody who's studied the facts, which is one thing the Democrats don't want you to do. That's why they call anybody who challenges the election an insurrectionist, who should be really in camps and getting re-educated. But the Pew Trust found that the way they send out the paper ballots is to names on the registration rolls. The Pew Trust, which is a liberal philanthropy, did a study of the voter registration rolls and found that 24 million people who are on them shouldn't be. They're either dead or they're illegal, or they moved to another state, and so forth. But that's not all the Democrats have done. They want to abolish the Electoral College, which is written into the Constitution because it's part of the system of checks and balances. It forces candidates to compete in states which are contested, as opposed to states like California and New York or Minnesota, where they've one way or another already fixed the ballots so that people, or Washington, D.C., where 93% of the people who are mainly federal workers vote for Democrats. So it's a very clever system. And it actually works in favor of the Democrats, because the major population states with the most electoral votes are already Democrat states like New York and California. But the Democrats want to destroy the Electoral College. They actually have put up a proposal to abolish the Senate, and are saying all the time how the Senate is undemocratic. And they've opened our southern border in the midst of a global pandemic. So in addition to having sex traffickers, billion-dollar cartel, criminal cartels, ordinary criminals, rapists. I just watched a congresswoman today describe, she was down on the border and interviewing people, how 50% of the children who are coming unaccompanied have been given, of the girls have been given birth control, 50% by their parents, because they know they're going to be raped. This is what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have invited, this it's a human catastrophe, what's going on our southern border. But it's designed to destroy our country. You can't have a country without borders. What makes America great and prosperous is not as Marxists think. And the Democrat Party is, for all intents and purposes, now a Marxist party. It's not from plundering the third world. It's a culture. And actually, it's a Protestant culture, a Protestant ethic of savings and hard work. And of course, the fact that we are so inclusive and tolerant actually helps us to attract talent from all over the world. That's what makes us prosperous. But if you open this other, there's 180 million people or 200 million people in South America who inhabit incredibly corrupt societies run mainly by socialists. They have the natural resources. They just have a corrupt culture. But the left never pays any attention to culture. So the Democrat Party really is organized to create a one-party state. In other words, they're totalitarians, or a better word might be fascists or communists. But our universities have been so corrupted by Marxists that communists are okay. So fascist is probably the best term. And it also is more accurate in the sense that both in Italy and Germany, fascism was a coalition between a fascist political party and the corporations, which is what's happened with Silicon Valley. And now, it's like 100 corporations have come out against voter IDs. This is really a nightmare. The most fundamentally anti-American thing about the Democratic Party is that it's a racist party. Identity politics, which is really cultural Marxism, it's the idea that America is defined by racial hierarchies and gender hierarchies. And it's a war. They replaced Marxist class war with a race war, which is they have spent the more than 50 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which, by the way, outlawed systemic racism and institutional racism, which is why you know that there is no systemic racism in America, except for, of course, affirmative action programs, which have been sanctioned by the Supreme Court in one of its worst decisions. But if there was systemic racism, it's illegal. So there would be a tsunami of lawsuits collecting hundreds of millions of dollars from, say, police departments, if they actually were systemically racist. They'd also have to get rid of all the Black police chiefs. It seems that almost every mayor or every police chief in a major city where there's been some incident that's been distorted as a racial incident is Black. And if you think the way Democrats do, that any white person who disagrees with them is a white supremacist, there's still thousands of Black attorneys. There are Black attorney generals, Black district attorneys, Black mayors, Black city council members, Black congressional members, Black state officials. They'd be suing, but they're not. And they're not because systemic racism is a figment of Patrice Cullors and Joe Biden's disturbed imaginations. I don't know how else to put it. Biden actually said, as one of his first statements, that systemic racism touches every aspect of American life, a monstrous lie. This is what our enemies use as propaganda, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians. They want America to be divided by race, which is what the Democrat Party is about today. It comes out of their mouths every time they move their lips And every time they move their lips, they lie. So the appropriate term for the regime we have in Washington is fascist. And my concern, one of the reasons that I think this book is one of the more important books I've written, is that conservatives are light years behind in the language they use. Because words are the weapons of political war, and the Democrats have declared war on everybody who disagrees with them. As I say, I mean, the last sentence of my book is that this is not about one election or Donald Trump. It's about establishing a one-party state, and they're well on their way to actually doing that. But right now we have Republicans, I can't believe it, calling people, I call her Nazi Pelosi. Nazi Pelosi, liberals. What are they liberal about except hard drugs, sex, spending other people's money, coddling criminals, and aiding and abetting our enemies? That's what they're liberal about. Everything else, they're ruthless. And, I'll finish in a second, but we have two events taking place in our country that shows it. The one is in Minnesota again, where everybody in power is a Democrat. This police officer, Kim Potter, is the latest victim of what I call the national lynch mob. A lynch mob is impatient with due process, doesn't think it can get justice from due process. So it demands first the verdict, and then you can have the trial. Actually, it's first the verdict and the punishment. And this woman has already been convicted and severely punished. This police officer, Kim Potter, 26 years of stellar service in the police department of Brooklyn Center, protecting its citizens. And now she's charged with manslaughter. She has $100,000 bond for bail, $100,000 for somebody who spent 26 years of public service, has no blemish on her record. And what about the so-called victim? Dante Wright is a violent criminal. What you hear, even decent Democrats like Harold Ford, I watched him on the 5 today, say that he was killed. Nobody should be killed for a traffic stop. He wasn't killed for a traffic stop. He was stopped for a traffic stop, and they ran his name or his license plate, or whatever it was, and got his criminal record. And he was wanted for jumping bail, $100,000 bail, which tells you he did something really bad, for an armed robbery. And this was the nature of this guy is a dirtbag. You wouldn't know that because the family has put up all these pictures of him with a little kid on his lap all the time. But what he did was he went to a party at someone's house he obviously knew, with a friend, a male friend, and it got very late. And the hostess invited them, if they wanted to stay at the house overnight. They got up in the morning, and Dante Wright grabbed this woman who had been so kind to him by the throat, put a gun to her head, and demanded all her cash, which was something like $850. So when the officers, they got all this information, they realized, first of all, they're in a very dangerous situation. Just last week, there had been a traffic stop. And the reason that these stops are so dangerous is because a car can be an arsenal of weapons. And just this last week, a violent criminal was stopped. He got out of his car. That's why they tell him to get out of the car. First, show your hands, then get out of the car. And then he lunged back into the car and grabbed a rifle and killed the officer. So this poor woman knew that her life was in imminent danger when Dante Wright jumped into his vehicle, resisting the arrest. And she shot him. If she had shot him with her weapon, I would consider it justifiable homicide. But she thought that her weapon was a taser. And you could see it, you panic. When you're facing life, your own life and death, you can panic and your brain can freeze. So this violent criminal, when it's called, he's guilty of getting himself killed. But that's not, of course, the way you see it. Now, why would he resist arrest? Because he was wanted for armed robbery and jumping $100,000 bail. He was facing a long jail time. This is a gangster. But our Democrats and leftists have so inverted our normal way of thinking about things that they, in this case, have reversed it. And the family, of course, they're feeding this myth that it's a white versus black, that's an innocent black victim, and providing these pictures of him with a kid on his lap, probably looking younger than he looks, and certainly less menacing than he is. Why are they doing that? Because they're going to get millions of dollars. George Floyd's family got $27 million for a lifetime criminal who, because he was so high on drugs, got himself killed in a similar fashion. Well, I'm not going to justify Chauvin's knee, but I actually have I've done another book which will be out in the fall, so I know something about this. There were 44 in the last 5 years in the Minneapolis Police Department uses of the knee restraint on criminals. Not one of them died because their bodies weren't filled with the kind of drugs that George Floyd's was, 4 times the lethal dose of fentanyl, for example, not to mention the methamphetamines, not to mention the heart disease that he already suffered, not to mention the effects of COVID and so forth. Of course, we're going to get riots. I mean, this lynch mob will not stop until they have destroyed our police forces. This is the insurrectionary movement. Breonna Taylor, you probably know that name. She was an accomplice to a major drug dealer, helped him in his criminal activities, which is why police appeared at her house with a warrant, by the way. And she's dead because her boyfriend shot the police as they were coming in, and she was killed in the crossfire. Her family got $12 million. This is where we are in our country today. If you want to understand the nature of this fascism, just shift your eyes to the Capitol. And on the same day that this poor policewoman was arrested, the chief racist in the Justice Department, a woman named Kristen Clark, who's part of the defund the police movement and is a Farrakhanite racist. She and the Justice Department, she's the head of the Civil Rights Division, announced that they were not going to release the identity of the Capitol police officer who killed Ashley Babbitt, and that there was not going to be any investigation and there would be no charges filed against him. So Nancy Pelosi is protecting a murderer. Ashley Babbitt was a 14-year Air Force veteran. She's a small woman. She was unarmed. There's video of her being murdered. She presented no threat to anyone. She was just shot. And the photographer, who was a Hispanic journalist, has been arrested. That's fascism. What else do you call it? You know, and of course, Nancy Pelosi is very good and acting as the head of the Gestapo, isn't she? She took an event in the Capitol where they didn't burn the Capitol. They didn't destroy a lot of things. They a lot of them just wandered in once the Capitol was breached. Why there were no Capitol police to protect the Capitol? When Donald Trump offered 10,000 troops for that night that were turned down by Pelosi, well, you know, there's not going to be an investigation into Pelosi's collusion in setting up. This is identical, really, to the Reichstag fire. The Weimar Republic was a democracy. Hitler actually won the chancellorship and was the head of state. And the minute that happened, the Nazis contrived to burn their own capital, the Reichstag, and blame it on a Dutch communist, and then institute laws to suppress their opponents, and an atmosphere of suppression, which is exactly what Nancy Pelosi is doing. You may have forgotten, but they tried to throw Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz out of Congress. And actually, the Black Lives Matter people in Congress, their congressional pawns like Cori Bush, were demanding that 100 Republicans be expelled from the Congress because they were part of an armed insurrection and because they were questioning an election. When the Democrats have challenged the certification of electors in all the three last Republican victories, Bush in 2000, 2004, and Trump in 2016. So by declaring it an armed insurrection, they are delegitimizing their opposition, aren't they? All 75 or 80 million Trump supporters. There were no arms. That doesn't stop them from calling it an armed insurrection. And it's not, you can't have an insurrection without arms. What's going on in the streets with the overt agenda of destroying the police, that's an insurrection. That's all Democrats. Those are all Democrat voters. And that's what Kamala Harris is called, the coalition of conscience. So my book is a warning. I mean, I show where it all comes from. It really is all built into this racist ideology. You know, the biggest racist organization in America by far is the Nation of Islam, which is headed by a Black supremacist. You never see those words put together. I'm very fearful for what will happen to our country. My hope and actually some, you know, my confidence comes from the fact that of the change that's overcome the right in the last couple of years, thanks to Donald Trump. When I came into the right, which is the party of America, American patriotism, the only true liberals in our country are conservatives. We believe in two sides to a conversation because we will win every argument. We're confident in our positions. The Democrats just make things up. It's unbelievable. You listen to the double talk of Jerry Nadler today about the Supreme Court, or any time, you know, Biden opens his mouth, there's usually 3 or 4 lies per sentence. But when I came into the right, I looked around and said, where's the ground army? The left has all these organizations that harass, threaten politicians and corporations until they do their bidding. And we see the results now that we have 100 giant American corporations coming out opposing voter IDs, which is the foundation of any election system that has any kind of integrity whatsoever. But there was nobody on the right. The Tea Party started this. They had marches. There were never conservative marches, really, maybe Operation Rescue, but aside from them, there were no conservative marches. Trump has now created, for the first time in American history, a mass conservative movement that can fight at every level of society and needs to begin with the schools, which are just indoctrination centers for Maoist indoctrinations, racist indoctrinations. And it's just epic child abuse with these gender indoctrinations that they have. Trump got, in the phony elections, 75 million votes. They probably got 80 million. But those 75 million votes were 10 million votes more than he got the first time, despite nonstop 24/7 slander from all the major media, calling him a white supremacist. For crying out tears, Trump was in public life. Everybody knew who Trump was for 30 years. Nobody ever introduced him as the host of The Apprentice and a white supremacist until he ran against a Democrat. He got 10 million more votes than he got the first time. No president in our history has gotten more votes in the second term. Barack Obama lost about 4 million. And you're going to tell me that a basket case and brazen liar like Joe Biden, that 47 years in public life as a racist on both sides of the color spectrum, that this guy who couldn't put together crowds of 30 people got more votes than Barack Obama by far in his first election. Nobody can convince me or persuade me of that. So Trump has left us with and he's of course still around organizing this. He will transform the Republican Party into a fighting machine instead of the patsies that they are now. It's like, hit me again, boss. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I assume there are some people here.
You assume correctly, David. Thanks for that. We do have some questions coming in fast and furiously here, so I'll try to get to them as many as I can. One questioner asked, and you had mentioned this just a moment ago about the educational system. One questioner wants to know how we can take back the educational system. He says, it seems to me that to turn around the country, we need to take that back. So
you have to organize parents. You have to go in, you have to find out what your kids are being taught. And you have to go and make the lives of these teachers miserable and the school boards until you just have, look, I've said this now for the last 40 years. Look at how the left operates. Don't become barbarians like them, but they are brilliant at political warfare. If you get up in the faces of these teachers, go to school board meetings, descend on their classrooms enough, they will change. It's that simple. Why do these CEOs of corporations, why are they supporting things that are so obviously indefensible? Because they're terrified. They're terrified of the left making their lives miserable. So you just have to return the favor. I, for the life of me, can't understand when Twitter is deplatforming the president of the United States. Why wasn't there demonstrations at the Twitter headquarters? Why weren't there crowds making their lives miserable and drawing attention to their censorship? No, conservatives like to sit on panels and give their opinions to audiences which are constricted because, whether there are 3 decent channels that we have, news channels, which is, I'll start with the best of them, Newsmax and OAN, and then Fox, which is great at the 6 o'clock hour when Tucker is on. But otherwise it's somewhat problematic. So that's the way you do it. And you do it by fighting fire with fire. Why The only Republican I know who's called a Democrat, and it was a black Democrat, a racist, is Donald Trump. The only Republican I know who has said that the left are fascists, besides me, is Donald Trump. Why are conservatives using such, what is it, pussyfooting language? It's like they're so well bred, they don't want to embarrass their enemies in public. That's suicide, people, for this country. So you have to get up in their faces, call them racists. I mean, what is this white supremacy nonsense except pure racism? Everybody with a white skin has white skin privilege. The only skin privilege in this country that's given by government is people of color skin privilege, and they don't even give it to, like if you're Sri Lankan, you have very dark skin, but you're considered white. You don't come under the affirmative action rules. But if you're black, you go to the head of the line for a job, you go to the head of the line to get into college, you go to the head of the line for a job promotion, you go to the head of the line for free goodies. I mean, what did Obama give away? $2 billion in cell phones. I mean, it's a gravy train. And the idea that black people are oppressed, they're marginalized, is a bad joke. It's ludicrous. Black people are the center of attention in our nation. All day, every day, we're focused on the problems of blacks and ignoring the fact that the majority of blacks are in the middle class. So the inner city blacks who are marginal and who do have a lot of problems, including rampant crime problems. About 2% of the population of black males, 2% of the total population commit 50% of the violent crimes. And they commit 90% of the interracial violent crimes, black on white, as opposed to white on black. And these are all things you can't talk about. But a mass movement that's not afraid, that's willing to take some hits. I mean, look, Trump has been such a model. What human being could endure the attacks and the slanders that Trump has? And he lost $1 billion. He's got billions, but he's lost fortunes doing this, in addition to having his reputation shredded and having to endure all these attacks on himself and his family. So the least other people can do is, don't necessarily, you're going to have to exceed your comfort zone somewhat. But, don't be afraid to fight because you're going to get some wounds.
David, along those same lines, about pushing back against the left in the field of education, another questioner asks a similar question about the mainstream media. He says, in my opinion, the corrupt mainstream media is the biggest threat we face.
Why Don Lemon is a racist. Chris Cuomo is a racist, and they're liars. And you have to use those terms. I mean, if you watch even, The Five, which has some really bright people on it, they're very nice. They soften. They're always, conservatives are always softening what they're saying. Why isn't Nancy Pelosi called the fascist that she is? She lies through her teeth, and she operates the way that actually the Nazis. Well, take that, the banning of Dr. Seuss. We call it cancel culture. How charged is that? Not really. Cancel culture. I mean, but it's like you cancel an appointment. I mean, come on. It's book burning. It's what the Nazis did in the 30s. They're book burners. Why don't I hear those terms? I watched all through the Dr. Seuss thing. I didn't hear anybody say it was book burning. I mean, of course, I didn't watch every channel. But yeah, the media has to be battered and bruised. This is a war, people. The Democrats don't screw around. And they will do whatever they can get away with. I mean, that should be really obvious from calling, Pelosi, she called this 300 people, unarmed people who they didn't even do as much as the rabid anti-Semite Linda Sarsour did. Linda Sarsour led a mob every day into the Capitol hearings to obstruct them. And they were arrested and immediately released. They had to be removed. Her purpose was insurrection, to destroy a government function. That, she just wanted them to hang Kavanaugh. But that was mobocracy in the halls of Congress. There was no, what did the Democrats say about it? It's democracy in action. That's what they said.
Another questioner asked, this is a...
It would be funny if it weren't so sad for our country's future.
Yes. Another questioner for a slight shift here says, do you think that the regular working Joes in the Democrat Party are shocked and or scared by what has happened to their party? Do you think?
I think there are very few working Joes left in the Democrat Party. They would be mainly federal workers, if you call them working Joes. The Democrat Party is, what did Rush used to call it? The arts and croissant crowd. It's academics. It's the intellectual elites who have just disgraced themselves. They destroyed the New Yorker, the Atlantic. These are terrible racist rags now. Anybody who enjoys the literary, and artistic commentary in these once elite journals, has to just, be brokenhearted at what they've done to them.
I had mentioned at the outset, or I'd quoted you at the outset, actually, that the country is facing a rift that is more serious than at any time since the Civil War. And along those lines, one of the questioners says, do you believe...
Correct, because the Confederacy at least had the honesty to secede and attack the United States and its Constitution. Of course, they did it in the name of the Constitution, just like Pelosi. But these people are inside. They're in the White House. They're running the country.
Oh, the questioner asks, do you believe that a peaceful partitioning of the country is doable?
No, I'm not for surrendering an inch. These are fascists. They're fascists. We have to crush them. And we have to first, gather the weaponry. I'm very proud of, I'm not the editor of Front Page. I have my 2 cents and I suggest articles every now and then, but I'm very proud of my team at the center of what they've done. There's no other publication like Front Page Mag and like what the center produces, warning people of the danger of this absolute threat. And yet, I think the Democrats have really overreached. Just their crimes against the country actually begins with, how could they put up an Alzheimer's case to be president of the United States? And then, of course, they stole the election. At the end of my book, The Enemy Within, I deal with the evidence of the election. You can't draw, if you draw a conclusion like I just did, it's a guess. I think it's pretty obvious that they stole the election. Just from what I said about 24 million names on the voter register rolls being phony. And that, does anybody know the percentage by which Joe Biden won? 0.027%. I have never seen that figure except as on the television screen. I've never seen anybody mention that. There were 159 million votes. He won by 40,000 in 6 battleground states. And we know, for example, just in Pennsylvania, there were 1 million votes that were illegally cast because they were cast under rules made by the Supreme Court, where the Constitution explicitly says it's up to the state legislature to make the rules. And they were, anyway. I give the evidence, or such evidence as I could amass, at the end of my book. But putting Joe Biden up there, I mean, we don't know who's running the, we know. It's all the people around Biden, Kamala, and all these wretched people. Why was Kamala Harris chosen to be his running mate? She got 2% of the vote in the Democrat presidential primary in California, where she had been the district attorney of San Francisco and then the attorney general for the state. 2%. They picked her. And if you remember in the campaign debates, she called Joe Biden a racist and a rapist, and then joined his team. That's her character. They picked her because she will cover up for all of the criminality that's going on there. Now, the Biden family is what? It's the second criminal family the Democrats have given us in a generation to run the country.
One questioner asks if you could help make sense of the contradictions in the left's own positions. For example, he has a couple of examples. One is they want to abolish the police, but at the same time, their totalitarian system needs a massive police force. Or
they have no problem with that. Look, they got a murderer in the Capitol Police Force that they're protecting. You think what did Nancy Pelosi do besides calling it an armed insurrection? She ordered 25,000 National Guardsmen to guard the Capitol from a non-existent threat at a cost of $500 million. These people are not shy about using power when they have it. So they will have their own Gestapo. They'll just transform the FBI. It's not going to be hard. There are people in jail in Washington without bail because they were present on January 6th. It's been 4 months they've been held without bail. For what? For trespassing. There's no, believe me, that problem the Democrats will solve without giving it a second thought.
I think we might have time for a couple more questions. One questioner says the left is moving so fast to establish a totalitarian government that it doesn't appear we have time to work within the system to stop them. Is there any chance that the military would step in to prevent the left from
already corrupt the military? Thank you, Obama, a lifelong communist. Obama comes from the same background I did. The only difference is he never left the communist movement. And I mean that quite literally. His entire career was funded and organized by the communist left, the Hate America left from the 60s, until he became a national figure. And Obama has put in all these political generals. We have a racist now. Look, this General Austin is conducting a witch hunt in the military as we speak. They had a stand down so he could purge the military. They've got these diversity trainers teaching in our military schools to hate America. I mean, Trump tried to stop it at the end. I don't think, even though, the Trump years were a kind of education, as it were, for conservatives, but very late. Trump made a big mistake in that he saw the fraud coming. In July 2020, the Democrats dispatched 600 lawyers and 10,000 volunteers to go through the states and change the election laws so they could steal the election. It was all done under the guise of ending voter suppression, making voting easy. Yeah, making it easy to commit fraud. that's when they should have been challenged in the courts. The judiciary is scared. They don't want to change an election after the fact because they're afraid of getting the court packed. So you can see that they're skittish. So it's Republicans were just not prepared for this fight. And then you had look, we lost the election in Republican-controlled states. The legislature, the Pennsylvania legislature, the Georgia legislature, I don't know all of them, but I think Arizona too. Republicans are, play by the rules. They just averted their eyes from the reality, the sinister reality. And when we set up the center, that's the center has been warning this. The motto of Front Page Magazine is inside every liberal or inside every progressive is a totalitarian screaming to get out. We tried to warn people. They didn't listen. The university, I wrote 5 books about the communist takeover of the universities. And, I had some support from Republicans, but it was very tepid and it was toothless. They did nothing. And I began the campaign, the university campaign around the turn of the century, around 2000, and in earnest in 2003. I delayed it because of 9/11. But Republicans control the purse string. 85% of our students go to state schools. They're totally dependent on Republican legislatures to fund them. What have Republicans done with that leverage? Nothing. That's the problem. But it also means that, if we're in earnest about this battle, and I think that these riots, they're really insurrections, are waking people up, and the blatant racism of the Democrat Party, and I'm really taken aback by the lies. I don't remember being in the left that lied so obviously and so often as the progressives do, so-called. And they're wonderful at political warfare. They've got the language, which they're not progressive. These are incredible reactionaries. They're operating out of a playbook that was written by a crackpot named Marx, almost 200 years ago, crying out tears.
Speaking of the left, you've got a section in your book called Stormtroopers, in which you talk, could you talk about some of who?
That's a term that Nancy Pelosi used to describe federal agents who went in to protect a federal courthouse in Portland. Nancy Pelosi has no compunction about calling Republicans enemies of the state. But I know there's a lot of conservatives out there, when they see my book, The Enemy Within, and they see the faces, I don't know if you can see it, but the faces on the cover, they'll be horrified. But yet they take it when Nancy Pelosi calls them enemies of the state, not even enemies of the people.
Could you name a few, apart from Nancy Pelosi and some politicians, but maybe some other enemies within? I know Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the figures.
Yeah, he's a raving lunatic racist who won the National Book Award, a MacArthur Genius Award, and has been praised to the skies. He's got a editorship at the Atlantic. The whole intellectual establishment has embraced Ku Klux Klan type racism. This is somebody who says that Black people, there is no Black on Black crime because it's the fault of whites. That's what he says in his book. It's in this book I wrote.
Another questioner asks, how do we deal with someone like billionaire agitator George Soros? Poland abandoned him. What can we do?
Why wasn't he arrested? Why didn't Trump's Justice Department, why didn't they investigate it? Well, of course, the first thing the Democrats did was screwed up Trump's Justice Department. Unfortunately, it was one of these by the book conservatives, Jeff Sessions, a really decent guy, but played by the rules. The way he interpreted them was squeaky clean and just surrendered the Justice Department to the left. Of course, they should prosecute. Look, every time a street is occupied or a bridge is blocked, every time where there's no permit, that you can't have a parade without a permit for obvious reasons. You block traffic, you block ambulances, police can't do their business. None of these leftist insurrections have permits. Everybody participates, and I'm talking about the so-called peaceful protests as well. Everybody should have been subject to arrest, and they should have been given year-long sentences, particularly the rioters, maybe the protesters. 3 months would be enough to disrupt their lives, to make them think twice before marching without a permit. And the irony is that the racists in Charlotte, they got permits, but the radicals who showed up and who were the aggressors in causing those riots, they didn't. But we have a lawless country right now when it comes to left-wing, what do you want to call them? I leave it up to the audience to give them a name.
David, I'm afraid we looks like we're just about out of time now, so I think I'm going to have to wrap it up. But thanks very much for that, and thank you, everybody. Sadly, that's all the time we have for today's Freedom Center webinar. Thank you for joining us. Please check us out at frontpagemag.com, where you will find a link to order David's new book, The Enemy Within, as well as the best conservative political commentary anywhere. Don't forget to check back next week for another webinar. I'm Mark Tapson. Thank you again and good evening.